In the winter of 1817, London wore its grief like a second skin, draped in black crape and hushed beneath falling snow, and nowhere was its cruelty more delicately practiced than in the ballroom of Lady Harrington's final assembly. Chandeliers blazed overhead, violins wept obediently, and yet Lady Emmeline Ashford stood untouched at the edge of the floor, her pale blue gown immaculate, her gloved hands folded as though she were a guest already departed. She was 23, an age at which hope should have been abundant, yet every whisper that drifted past her carried the same quiet verdict. She had been weighed, found wanting, and dismissed. They did not speak of scandal aloud. They never did. Instead, it lived in sighs and sidelong glances, in the careful way mothers turned their daughters from her path. A letter once misdelivered, a carriage seen at dusk, a gentleman who failed to defend her. These fragments had fused into a narrative Emmeline had never been permitted to correct. Too serious, they said, too plain, too honest for a world that prized sparkle over substance. Pity followed her like a shadow, and she would have preferred outright disdain. From her place beside the gilded wall, Emmeline watched the ritual unfold. Partners were claimed, promises implied, futures quietly negotiated with bows and smiles. When the music swelled and the dancers formed their set, she remained alone, the space beside her conspicuously empty. Her mother, seated across the room, did not look in her direction. That hurt more than any whisper. It was the look of a woman counting losses she could no longer afford. By the end of the evening, the decision had already been made. There would be no fourth season, no miraculous reversal of fortune. Emmeline was to be sent north to her uncle's estate, framed as a restorative visit, though both knew it for what it was, retreat. London had spoken, and it had no further use for her. The carriage departed before dawn, wheels crunching through frozen slush as the city receded into gray silence. Snow clung to the windows, blurring familiar streets into indistinct shapes, as though the world itself wished to forget her. Emmeline sat upright, spine straight despite the ache in her chest, determined to carry her disgrace with dignity. She had learned, by necessity, that composure was the final refuge of the unwanted. It was not until they passed beyond the city's reach that the tears came, quiet and precise, never staining her gloves. She told herself she mourned only the loss of expectation, not love itself, for love had never truly been offered. What she mourned was choice. She had not failed because she was unworthy. She had failed because society required women to shine without ever casting shadow. As the miles lengthened, Emmeline resolved to disappear politely. If she must be set aside, she would do so without bitterness, without spectacle. Yet even as she formed this vow, a treacherous hope stirred beneath it, small and unwelcome, that somewhere beyond London's judgment there might exist a life not measured by rumor. By nightfall, the snow thickened, sealing the roads and the sky alike. The future lay ahead of her, indistinct and cold, but not yet concluded. And though Emmeline did not know it, her quiet exile was already drawing her closer to a man equally undone by expectation, a meeting not of ambition but of reckoning, waiting patiently for winter to deliver them both. The carriage lamps flickered as darkness settled, and with each mile Emmeline felt herself passing from spectacle into obscurity, a transition both merciful and terrifying. She wondered who she might become when no eyes demanded performance, when silence replaced judgment. In London, she had been defined by absence, of suitors, of defenders, of mercy, but the road offered no answers, only space. Wrapped in wool and resolve, she stared into the whitening night and practiced the art of endurance, telling herself that worth need not be witnessed to exist. Somewhere ahead stood a house she scarcely remembered, an uncle kind but distant, and days shaped by quiet rather than expectation. It was not happiness she anticipated, merely survival with her name intact. Yet even that modest desire felt radical in a world that had taught her to apologize for breathing. As the snow deepened and the horses slowed, Emmeline closed her eyes and allowed herself one forbidden thought, that exile might yet become passage, and winter, so skilled at stripping life bare, might also prepare the ground for something unimagined. She did not know whose life this road would intersect with hers, only that the hush of snow felt less like an ending than a held breath. Fate, patient and unseen, traveled beside her carriage, waiting for the moment to speak. Lady Emmeline Ashford arrived at her uncle's northern estate beneath a sky the color of iron, the house rising from the snow like a relic of another age, stern and indifferent to comfort. The wind carried the scent of coal, smoke, and frost, and with it the sense that this land answered to harsher laws than London's polite cruelties. She was received with kindness, but little ceremony, for this was a place where warmth was practical rather than performative. Days passed quietly until the announcement arrived that transformed her seclusion into obligation. A political gathering, hosted by her uncle at the Crown's request, intended to secure northern coal interests vital to the nation's recovery after war. The estate filled swiftly with men of influence, their boots tracking snow across polished floors, their voices confident with entitlement. Emmeline observed them from the margins, practiced in invisibility, when a sudden hush rippled through the room. Sebastian Hale, Duke of Ravensmere, had arrived without flourish, his presence marked not by arrogance but by gravity. He was younger than she expected, broad-shouldered yet restrained, his dark coat unadorned, his expression carved by experiences that refused embellishment. This was a man who had learned discipline from loss rather than privilege. Whispers followed him, though of a different nature than those that haunted her. He was the sole surviving heir of an old title, his brothers buried on foreign soil, his inheritance forged through death rather than design. He greeted his hosts with courtesy stripped of warmth, declining flattery as one might decline a debt. Emmeline noted how little he smiled, and how attentively he listened, as though measuring every word for truth rather than advantage. Their first exchange was brief and unremarkable, an introduction demanded by courtesy. He bowed, she curtsied, and yet something unsettled her in his eyes, a familiarity of restraint. When her reticule slipped from her grasp moments later, it was the Duke who retrieved it from the floor, returning it with a solemn nod that acknowledged her without appraisal. The gesture, small and unassuming, lingered longer than the formalities that surrounded it. As dinner progressed, tensions surfaced beneath the veneer of civility. The Crown's representatives pressed for concessions, while landowners resisted with polished obstinacy. Sebastian spoke sparingly, but when he did, the room shifted. He questioned the ethics of profit extracted from exhausted men, of wealth built upon grief unacknowledged. His words were measured, yet carried the weight of conviction, and several faces hardened in response. Emmeline watched, astonished, as power recoiled from principle. Later, as snow thickened outside and tempers cooled poorly, Emmeline overheard her name spoken again, this time as warning. A gentleman murmured that her reputation made her unsuitable company for a man of the Duke's standing. The remark stung less than it once would have, though it carved deeper nonetheless. What startled her was the Duke's reply, quiet but firm, that a woman's worth was not adjudicated by rumor. Silence followed, sharp and telling. The evening drew on, the fire crackling as alliances strained. Emmeline felt a familiar pull to retreat when a sudden storm descended with violent intent. Wind battered the windows, snow sealing roads with ruthless speed, and word spread that no carriage could depart until morning. The house, once merely cold, became a refuge by necessity, and unease threaded the air as surely as smoke. In the enforced proximity, Emmeline sensed a shift, as though isolation had pressed everyone closer to their truest selves. She stood by the window, watching the storm erase the world beyond glass, when the Duke joined her at a respectful distance. He spoke of the weather, of travel, of nothing that required courage, yet his presence felt deliberate. Before she could speak, he excused himself, summoned away by matters of state. leaving behind the impression of an unfinished sentence. As the night settled, Emmeline realized that her quiet exile had intersected with something volatile and unresolved. The Duke of Ravensmere was not merely a man of title, but of defiance, and in his orbit lay danger as real as the snow piling against the doors. She returned to her chamber with her thoughts unsettled, aware that the storm had trapped more than bodies within the estate. It had enclosed secrets, convictions, and two lives poised unknowingly on the edge of consequence. Sleep came poorly, burdened by the memory of his voice and the way the room had stilled around him, as though authority had met its mirror. Emmeline understood, with a clarity that unsettled her, that she had encountered a man as unwelcome to the powerful as she herself had been to society, and that shared estrangement carried its own dangerous gravity. Outside, the storm raged on, promising that morning would demand reckoning rather than retreat for them both. The storm deepened after midnight, sealing the estate in white silence and forcing its inhabitants into uneasy intimacy, as though the world beyond had withdrawn its permission for pretense. Lady Emmeline wandered the upper corridors, unable to sleep, her thoughts restless, her breath fogging the air as she passed tall windows glazed with frost. Candlelight trembled along the walls, revealing portraits of stern ancestors who had survived harsher winters and expected no less from the living. She paused near the long gallery, seeking solitude, only to hear voices drifting from the adjoining chamber, low and unguarded. She recognized the Duke's voice at once, stripped of its public reserve and weighted with exhaustion. He spoke to another gentleman, though not as one seeking agreement, but release. He spoke of brothers who had marched beside him and never returned, of letters unanswered, of prayers offered once and abandoned thereafter. He confessed that survival felt less like fortune than indictment, that the title he bore had been purchased with lies he loved. "God has taken everything," he said quietly, "and left me to justify the keeping of breath." The words settled heavily in the air, and Emmeline, unseen, felt them strike some hidden wound of her own. She withdrew before she was discovered, retreating into the gallery where moonlight spilled across the floor in pale bands. The enormity of his grief echoed her own quieter despair, and without intention or audience, she spoke aloud, her voice trembling yet clear. "No one has ever wanted me," she said, the admission escaping as though it had been waiting years for breath. The honesty of it startled her, tears gathering despite her resolve, and she turned toward the window to hide them from herself. Footsteps sounded behind her, measured and hesitant. Sebastian Hale halted several paces away, having followed the sound without expectation of consequence. He saw her reflection first, fragile in the glass, dignity strained but unbroken, and understood he had crossed into something sacred. She did not turn at once, perhaps sensing him, perhaps bracing herself for witness. When she did face him, her expression held no shame, only weary candor. He did not apologize for overhearing. Instead, he closed the distance slowly, as one approaches a wounded thing, and removed his glove before extending his hand. "I believe," he said, voice softened by something like reverence, "that God finally sent you to me." The words were not declaration but recognition, spoken without demand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her gloved hand in his, the contact brief yet irrevocable, as though both understood the weight of such a gesture. They stood thus, neither seeking more nor retreating, allowing silence to articulate what propriety forbade. Emmeline felt her breath steady beneath his gaze, felt herself regarded not as rumor, but as truth. She spoke then of London's judgment, of exile framed as mercy, of learning to survive on restraint alone. He listened without interruption, his attention a balm she had not known she required. In return, he spoke of duty's hollowness when stripped of purpose, of resisting alliances that demanded moral surrender. He confessed that the gathering below was already bristling with threats, that men of power had little patience for defiance cloaked in conscience. She understood then that his isolation was chosen, costly, and ongoing. In that understanding, her fear for him eclipsed concern for herself. The gallery grew colder as the candles waned, yet neither noticed. What passed between them required no vows, only acknowledgement. Before they parted, he pressed a small volume into her hand, a book worn from use. "It belonged to my brother," he said simply, trusting her with memory. She accepted it with care, aware that such gifts were not lightly given. They separated without promise, returning to their respective chambers with altered hearts. Emmeline lay awake, the book resting against her chest, her mind alive with possibility and dread. She knew the world would not permit such understanding to remain private for long. Yet as the storm eased outside, she felt, for the first time in years, that her existence had been met rather than endured. The night had not resolved her fate, but it had named her worth aloud, and that knowledge lingered like warmth against the encroaching dawn. When the roads cleared and London reclaimed them, it did so without mercy, as though the city had merely paused its judgment rather than forgotten it. Lady Emmeline returned altered yet cautious, carrying herself with a steadiness born not of approval but of truth privately earned. Word of the northern gathering had preceded her, distorted and sharpened, and whispers now linked her name to the Duke of Ravensmere with speculative delight. She understood too well how swiftly curiosity could harden into condemnation, and so she prepared herself for retreat once more, believing sacrifice the natural conclusion of affection. Sebastian Hale faced pressures of a different magnitude. Advisors urged prudence, allies warned of reputational consequence, and subtle threats followed him through drawing rooms and corridors of power. A duke, they reminded him, belonged not to himself but to influence. Marriage was not romance but strategy, and Lady Emmeline Ashford offered neither fortune nor favor. He listened with the same restraint he had learned in war, weighing their counsel against the cost of surrendering conviction. Each warning clarified rather than deterred him. Their meetings were few and careful, marked by glances weighted with understanding and words chosen for safety rather than desire. Emmeline saw the strain etched deeper into his composure and recognized her role in it. Love, she reasoned, should not demand ruin. On the morning of the Queen's winter reception, she resolved to withdraw gracefully, to free him from the consequences of choosing her. She dressed in pale silver, a color of quiet renunciation, and rehearsed composure as armor. The reception unfolded beneath crystal light and rigid smiles, the room dense with expectation. Emmeline felt herself once more an object of assessment when Sebastian entered, the air shifting as it had before. He crossed the floor without hesitation, stopping before her with a certainty that silenced speculation. She met his gaze, prepared to speak her farewell, but he addressed the room instead, voice carrying without effort. He declared his refusal to be governed by whisper or convenience, his rejection of a system that equated worth with advantage. Then, turning fully to her, he spoke her name as declaration rather than request. "I choose her," he said, each word precise. "Before God, before crown, before you all." The room stilled, shock rippling outward like frost. Emmeline felt time suspend as the meaning settled, irretrievable and public. She searched his face for doubt and found none, only resolve tempered by care. Tears threatened, but she held them in deference to the magnitude of the moment. There were consequences as promised. Murmurs rose, alliances cooled, and invitations quietly vanished. Yet there was also something unexpected, respect, grudging and gradual, born of witnessing a man relinquish power rather than principle. Emmeline stood beside him through it all, learning that dignity shared multiplied rather than diminished. Their wedding was held in winter, deliberately, beneath falling snow that softened the world rather than obscured it. The church was modest, the vows spoken without spectacle, yet every word rang with earned truth. Emmeline walked the aisle unafraid, no longer measuring herself by approval but by devotion freely given. Sebastian met her with a smile, unguarded at last. The burden of solitude lifted not by triumph, but by companionship. As they stepped into the cold together, bells tolling above them, the past loosened its grip. Gossip faded into irrelevance, replaced by the quiet authority of constancy. They did not change the world that had judged them, but they stepped beyond its reach, choosing a life defined not by rumor or rank, but by mutual regard. In the hush after celebration, as snow settled upon stone and street alike, Emmeline understood that love had not erased her scars, nor had it restored what was lost. Instead, it had named her worthy without condition, and in doing so had rewritten her fate. Winter, so often the season of endings, had become for them a beginning, held not in promise but in practice, enduring and unafraid.